Hello, and welcome to this latest episode of the Driving Net Profit with Zero Emissions podcast. I'm Barbara Albert, co-CEO of 100% Renewables, a consultancy that helps organizations to decarbonize. In today's episode, we're speaking about Iress, a leading technology company that designs and develops software and services for the financial services industry. The company is headquartered in Australia and listed on the ASX, and it operates across Asia Pacific, the United Kingdom, Africa, and North America, supporting a wide range of clients from small retail businesses through to large institutional organizations. Joining me today is Blaise Porter, who brings more than 15 years of experience in corporate sustainability and social responsibility. Her work spans sustainability strategy development and execution, carbon accounting and reporting, product stewardship, and the circular economy. Blaise also holds a Master of Sustainability and Climate Policy from Curtin University. Blaise has actually been on the podcast before, back when she was working at Sims, which was awarded the most sustainable company in the world in 2024. That conversation was episode 15, and we will include a link in the show notes if you would like to listen to it. In her most recent role at Iress, Blaise delivered the company's first ASRS report under Australia's new climate disclosure regime, AASBS2. Iress is one of the first companies reporting under this framework. Being among the first reporters under any new scheme is never easy, as most of us will know. The rules are still evolving. There is very little precedent to rely on, and in many ways, organizations are figuring things out as they go. So getting that first report out the door is a significant achievement in itself. But what I would really like to focus on today is Blaise's experience with one of the most challenging parts of climate reporting, Scope 3 emissions under AASBS2. Blaise recently shared some very practical insights on this topic, particularly around value chains, data quality, and the judgment calls companies need to make along the way. Today, we are going to unpack what Scope 3 reporting actually looks like in practice when you are one of the first companies doing it under a mandatory reporting scheme. Blaise, welcome back to the Driving Net Profit with Zero Emissions podcast. It's so good to have you back.
Oh, thank you. No, it's great to be back as well, Barbara.
Fantastic. So your most recent role was with Iress. So for listeners who may not be familiar with the company, can you explain what Iress does and the kinds of clients you work with?
So Iress is a software business that makes software for the financial services sector, and they have two main products. One is around global trading and market data. So a huge proportion of stock trades on the ASX and other global exchanges are made using our product. So for investors and brokers and people like that. And the other core technology solution is wealth management. And so that is our Xplan product. It's a really modular solution, which means it's used by everybody from, private wealth bankers through to, Blaise Porter financial planner that might run their business out of their small office or off their kitchen table. It's an Australian business and it's listed on the ASX.
Interesting. So Iress is a technology company. So some people might assume that the actual environmental footprint could be relatively small. How did sustainability become an important focus for the organization?
Well, I think Iress has always had that sort of like a community outward lens, which is really nice as a company, and always sort of seen itself as part of that ecosystem and recognised that sustainability was a concern of that ecosystem, I suppose. And as I said, it is listed and has been listed for a long time. So, of course, it's responded to that, demand from investors and their analysts to report. Even though the value chain, as you say, is not huge compared to some industries, but still was very much a concern. And Iress has got science-based endorsed targets as well. So it's been an area that the company's had a quite active role in.
Wow, okay, science-based target, that's interesting. So you mentioned being publicly listed and lots of investors, of course, wanting to know what the sustainability performance looks like. What are the material topics in terms of sustainability that are important for Iress?
So as you can imagine, like most companies, Iress's emissions are almost all in the value chain. So purchase goods and services makes up the biggest chunk. And then the biggest chunk of that is all that technical infrastructure. So third-party data centers and our cloud provider, followed by things like software licenses and capital goods for all of that technology. It's very, very much focused on what it is that we purchase and what we do. And then the second business category is business travel. So again, as an international business, there is a lot of travel, and that all comes back to the emissions footprint, of course.
Yeah, that will be a big part, of course. So, going back to the core of our podcast episode today, in your most recent role at Iress, you led the development of Iress's first ASRS report under AASBS 2. Tell us more about that. Which reporting group does Iress fall under? How big of an undertaking was it to prepare that first report?
It was a big undertaking. So, Iress is a Group 1 reporter, so meeting that first threshold, and interestingly, also a calendar year reporter. So, some of the very first, cabs off the rank in terms of producing this disclosure. So, there was definitely a lot of eyes on it, a lot of sort of like pressure not pressure, but a lot of interest internally to make sure that we got it right, and appreciation of the visibility of the first report being amongst that first tranche. So Iress had reported for on a voluntary basis for scope 1, 2, and 3 for a couple of years, and as I said, had set targets on it. So it wasn't entirely new to doing things. And I had done some scenario analysis before I got there, so there was a really solid baseline. But I think, like many companies are finding, the leap from what voluntary reporting looks like to what an ASRS disclosure looks like is really profound.
That's interesting. So you were voluntarily disclosing your emissions across all 3 scopes. You have an SBTI target. You were previously reporting under TCFD. Having all those key ingredients in place, how much of a difference is it to comply with S2?
It is a difference. And I think a large part of that is actually just then driven by, in particular, the requirement for assurance. So if you've never had assurance before, and then even if you have, and the shift, I think, from voluntary to regulatory assurance has totally changed the game. There's not a lot of wiggle room. That interpretation of what is also a new and evolving standard. So, when we say, oh, well, we're all learning together, then that is very true. It is the reality of the situation that, our interpretation or your interpretation as a reporting entity might be different from the interpretation that your assurers have. And so that process of collaboration to get to that assured outcome looks really different.
Definitely, and it must be so hard to be one of the first companies to go through the whole process, because there's no precedent to look to. Everyone's learning along the journey. Regulations also change, and because you're a calendar year reporter, like initially, for instance, I think the requirement was that your financial assurer had to assure your sustainability report, which was then changed to any assurance provider can do your sustainability report. So while you're doing this and working on these requirements and regulations still change around you, while you still have to go for it and report. So that's not an easy undertaking.
No, and no doubt that will continue to happen. So even for those companies who, might be in group 2 or 3, I think as more companies report, I guess there'll be a level of homogenization, right, where we all come together and some of those opinions agree. But that might mean that, the opinion that you'd sort of worked by will be different in future years. Of course, we're going to have an update from the Scope 3 standard from the GHG protocol in coming years as well. So, that might cause some difference of opinions, although I think it's really important. I know we've had this discussion, but it's really important to know that the GHG protocol and ASRS aren't the same. There's some really key differences in how you might think about that when you're a reporting entity. So yeah, it's being aware and being alive, of those differences, and that conversation that you have with all the stakeholders, including your assurers, is really critical, I think, to getting this process right and to keeping it moving.
I'm going to want to find out more about this. So you're saying that the greenhouse gas protocol value chain standard is not the same as the S2 requirements. So I want to definitely dive deeper.
You've got to be careful. And I think particularly for companies who have reported before, and so then you sort of come into it and you think, oh, cool, this will be fine, and then you're really learning on the spot. So there's a couple of things that are really different. And so one is that in the GHG protocol, they have this concept of the minimum boundary. So, as an example, when you think about commuting emissions, you have to consider commuting emissions, but you can consider optionally the emissions from working from home. And there's no optionality in ASRS. So you have to consider all the activity that is relevant. And then the guidance that came out just sort of quite late last year sort of draws into this again. And it sort of says, well, okay, relevance is one aspect, but materiality is the other one. And so materiality sort of means, well, you're probably going to have an estimate, even if you didn't think it was necessarily relevant. And it's actually sort of then a two-part test. And that's really different in the way that people might have thought about the inventories and what was inside the boundary and what was outside the boundary, just referring to the GHG protocol. I think the other big thing, yeah, right. And then the other big thing, this is a related concept, I suppose, to the GHG protocol, but ASRS makes it a lot more explicit, is that they have sort of this framework of data quality. And they actually then ask you to disclose really where you think you're up against it. And so that looks at your best things being sort of primary data, verified data. But for scope 3, a lot of us can't get that. That's actually quite difficult. And then sort of moving down into secondary data and what are the good characteristics of secondary data. Is it timely? Does it really represent your value chain? Does it represent the jurisdiction that that value chain activity takes place in? And so that can require a lot of trade-offs, and it requires a lot of thinking and a lot of documentation. Really requires some different thinking about the way that we assume things and the decisions that we make.
Well, so much, and I want to go and unpack this a little bit more, because that's going to be so interesting for listeners that have to undergo the same experience that you had to go through as a first reporter. So let's start with what you mentioned initially, the relevance versus the materiality. So is it true then that you can't really know what's material until you've got that estimate across all 15 scope 3 categories?
So there's some things obviously that businesses just will not do, right? If you don't have a franchise operation, then you don't have a franchise operation. You don't need to test it very much further. And I think to a large extent that may well depend on the business and what its value chain is. If you are a commodity business, or if you are making steel, then you are probably going to be arriving at a materiality determination for commuting much easier than a software business like Iress, or a business that has maybe a smaller or more flatter sort of inventory, for instance. But yeah, I would advise everyone to start thinking about materiality methodologies and estimation methodologies really early in the piece, because that is a conversation that 100% you're going to have to evidence and explain to your insurer why you think it is not material, as well as those relevancy criteria that you might apply to a particular category as well.
And of course, materiality all hinges on financial materiality for the users and readers of the financial reports.
Yeah, and that's quite a different concept as well, I think, for a lot of reporters. And of course, that does come back into then the decisions that you make about your climate risk and opportunity assessment that you're also disclosing, because a lot of the source of that risk or opportunity will be in the value chain that you're measuring. So you want to make sure that those thresholds and those data sources that you're considering to, use your risk assessment judgments on and the scope 3 assessment judgments on are the same ideally, or, at least really consistent, as close together as you can get them, so that you have got that robustness from the measurement through to the decision making.
Makes a lot of sense. A lot of our clients sometimes forget that when they have to do the risk assessment, that they have to broaden their minds, just to do with carbon accounting, that you not just look at your operations, you look upstream to your suppliers, you look downstream to your customers and partners, and it's all connected.
100% and 100%. And the activity, we all know that, the activity of your customers and suppliers, sort of, yes, that does form a core input into your scope 3. But only if you're getting their supplier specific data, right? If you're just using spend-based factors, and a lot of us are, and a lot of us no doubt will be for years to come, then that gives you a whole bunch of other questions that you've got to be able to ask and answer and document about the quality of that data.
Talking about the quality of the data, I'd like to go back to what you said earlier about the differences between primary and secondary data, between data that's verified and not verified. Before we go deeper, could you just briefly explain to our listeners what the difference is between primary and secondary data?
So primary data sort of comes from some entity, I suppose. So that might be like a measured process, from a supplier. And it would tell you, in an ideal world, right, that's exactly these emissions. And in a really, really ideal world, then it's also verified. Secondary data is, I guess, what we're more sort of accustomed to, where you might have activity data times an emissions factor. And so you're getting really an informed estimate.
Makes a lot of sense. So can you give an example of a real world example for Iress where you would use primary data and where you would use secondary data?
So for Iress, our purchase goods and services, as I mentioned before, is the largest one. And so we've got a mix of primary and secondary data in that category, where we do have our cloud supplier tell us exactly how many emissions they attribute to our use of their services. We get some electricity consumption data, which again is probably more equivalent to a secondary source really from some third-party data centers. And then at the moment for the remainder of the spend, we use an emissions factor that's based on the spend with those particular categories.
Mm-hmm. So how tricky is it to get the primary data from your suppliers? So from our experience, it's tricky because it's a bit nebulous. Sometimes you get it, sometimes you don't. Sometimes you get the underlying data and assumptions that went into it. Sometimes you don't.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes. So how do you best navigate this, and how do you deal with the mix of primary data and secondary data in your carbon accounting efforts? Because it's just exploding the effort, isn't it?
It is. It really does. And it's a lot of judgment, which is difficult in itself. There's no hard and fast rules. And you're absolutely right. The visibility of what you have or don't have in that supplier's data can really complicate life. And, for another example, when I was at Sims and we wanted to think about the use of the sold product, and however you use a reclaimed scrap metal product to make steel, it's very emissions intensive. And so we looked at the reports of our customers in this case to see if we could, get a supply specific data from publicly available reports. And we could not. And the core thing that really hampered this understanding was different companies reporting different things inside of that number. And companies that were more integrated in the value chain necessarily had a higher number than companies that were less integrated. But we couldn't tell from just reading the reports a lot of the times where those boundaries had been drawn. It's the common thing, probably pre-ASRS is that, we're not all reporting in the same way. There's, everything is different. Those units of denomination might be different. So some people might report per unit of production or per ton or per dollar or, what have you. And so very quickly you can find yourself with a bigger problem than you might have had at the start. And so it becomes, and of course, then you might have a separate issue that then your supply specific factors, even if so you can say, right, we're just going to go scope 1 and 2, really simple, let's do that. But then you've got a situation where if the rest of your spend-based factors are extended, and most of them are, there's sort of this environmentally extended factor that incorporates some upstream elements, your supplier specific factor is not really comparable on the same basis to the spend factor that you might have used before. So there's no easy answers. I'm sorry.
There is no easy answer because it's so complicated and everyone's trying to find their way through. Do you think that over time, as more and more companies are being called under mandatory reporting schemes, that we will just have more data available, which is going to make it easier or not?
I do. But I think there still is a question there for companies about proportionality. And what is easy to do, what is influenceable by them, and what is going to actually make a difference. And I think a huge part of this actually, is the job of the reporting entity to figure out what it is they want to do with that information. Right? If you just want to reduce the use of estimates and sort of say, well, we're moving towards a better quality data set, that is quite different outcome from saying we want our suppliers to reduce their emissions. And we will set some targets around that. Or, we have a scope 3 target. That's quite different from just saying we want to better understand risk. So it becomes really important, I think, for reporting entities or, people compiling their inventory to understand how it is that they're going to use that data and try and get value out of that.
Makes so much sense. So in a way, you're framing the whole exercise with the overarching question or question set that you have in terms of what you're actually trying to achieve, because the answers might change.
Exactly.
So much of scope 3 is all about collaboration. You're collaborating with your suppliers, with your partners, with your assurance providers. It's navigating your way through. How can we, I'm putting myself in the shoes of suppliers to businesses. They're getting bombarded nowadays with questions on providing their data, resulting in a lot of supplier fatigue. How can this best be managed? Like, what's the best way through this whole thing?
Again, right, I think it's really, I take a very hard line on this one in my practice, and that is, don't ask if you're not going to do anything about it. And that includes, don't ask if you're not going to put some measurable weighted criteria on that in your procurement decision making. Right? Like if you just want to know to get better quality data, you might have a couple of top tier suppliers that you can work with, and then you just, you might pick a narrow set to focus on. But certainly do not go to, your entire value chain or even 80% of your value chain and try and ask this question if you aren't actually going to make business decisions about it. And if you don't have a way to reward those suppliers who've actually putting in the effort and doing the right thing and, hopefully lowering their numbers and lowering their impact. If it's just going in to get some numbers crunched and you're sort of losing sight of that hard work, don't do that, right? So have a really good think. I think it's super critical for businesses to work this out before they ever start asking for their data, is how are they going to manage that in context of the overall supplier relationship? And as I say, in particular, how are they going to reward those suppliers who are doing well?
Yeah, and it also depends on the maturity of the suppliers you're talking to.
Yeah, and
it's not easy.
What we will find as well, which I think is interesting, is that over the next couple of years, particularly as some of those smaller, group 2 and group 3 companies report, those numbers will change, right? Even within company to company, as they start making some of these different relevance and materiality determinations, as they really get to grips with what's going into that inventory and what's going out of it, those numbers will change. They might really increase. So there's got to be, I guess, a level of grace and nuance in understanding these numbers that are reported.
Very, very true. So putting myself in the shoes of a reporting company that's never done any Scope 3 reporting, how many years do you think it will take to get the whole process in place of getting actual Scope 3 data that passes the assurance test?
Well, I think that is such an interesting question, because of course you can pass your assurance without having actual data. So you can have your whole Scope 3, by which I mean primary data. So you can have your whole Scope 3, using sort of spend-based factors or activity-based factors, where, we took this many, flights that went for this long, so therefore we put the factor on. And that you can do that and pass assurance, as long as you've made a good choice of factors or an appropriate choice of factors. You've written it down, you've documented all your assumptions, and you've applied all that thinking consistently. You can do that, and you can do that, in year one, essentially. Maybe I'm a bit, pessimistic on this one, but I don't know if most companies will ever get to a point where they have 100% actual data, in their inventory. And again, that comes back to a proportionality question. There will be no doubt, products, as there already are, products out there that sort of scrape information off the internet that might give you a better idea. But not every company will find those relevant. Not every company will find, the money to pay for these services, because again, it's going to depend on what that company wants to achieve with that data.
Mm-hmm. But is it a fair assessment to say that it's a much harder and more challenging task to put Scope 3 together than most companies think?
Yes. Yes, I think the difference between Scope 3 and Scope 1 and 2 is one, obviously, of a scope. We have sort of 15 categories compared to just these little exercises. And Scope 1 and 2 are really straightforward, right? You're like, great, I've got my electricity bill, you're ready to go, right? You don't need very much, and there's no judgment. The difficulty in Scope 3 is you have to really think. You've got to really think about your value chain. You've got to think about the factors that you choose. You've got to think about what it is that you want to do, because that is going to affect some of the decisions that you make about factors, right? You've got to make some trade-offs. Like we said about, you might have some great data that represents the jurisdiction, but it might be 5 years old, right? You might have, some data that's updated every year, but it doesn't exactly represent the value chain of, your product or your business. But, and so all these things you've really got to think through. And they might be quite different in the ways that you've done it in the past. And companies will do different things, right? They might have climate active, and then so there's a whole bunch of factors that go into that certification. But then if you don't want to do climate active anymore, then you lose access to all those factors, right? And that might give you quite your math suddenly turns out really different. So you need to be thinking through, a lot more of these judgment calls and a lot more of these assessments to really get through the nuance of Scope 3. And that can be what makes it quite complicated.
Mm-hmm. And then document everything in the basis of preparation.
100%. 100%. So, I think a good basis of preparations is an investment in future you and your mental health, as well as being, an investment in your assurance process and, your next year's process, because you've got to come back and do it all again. So
exactly.
I would 100% err on the side of having more in that basis of preparation, than you think you might need. As you're going through the process, put a half an hour in your calendar to remind you to go and check it, because we change our assumptions as we go through the process, and as we see how things stack up, or we get the result, we think, oh no, actually, we change the way we do things. So it's really critical to have that basis of preparations up to date.
Absolutely. So going back to what you said earlier you said that you think it's critically important to only engage with suppliers and make them provide you information if you're serious with the follow through. Could you talk us through a good process? What would be good practice around following through? You ask for data, how you're going to use that, how you're going to use that in your procurement decisions. Is there a good way to go about this?
And again, I don't necessarily think that there is a single answer, because it will really depend on what it is that you buy, and then the impact that that has on your footprint as a whole, and what other sorts of decision-making tools that you use. So, for instance, if you're using an internal carbon price, then that might just be the mechanism that you use to sort of in that procurement phase, rather than sort of complicating that. So, but an interesting example. So, at Sims, and we had a carbon price in place. To
Quite
think
high
about,
one too.
yeah, right.
Yeah.
Well, but to think about then, in particular, the use of diesel, right? And Sims had a really large scope one footprint, because it has all these, material handlers and front end loaders and trucks and things driving around the yard looking after the commodity. And so carbon pricing was really a great way to understand the use of diesel, and to price that out and to see what that did in terms of electric units over the cost of the lifetime and considering the total cost of ownership. But that's really easy to do when you've got, Model A that might use this much diesel versus Model B that uses this much versus Model C electric, right? There's a really straightforward bit of comparison to do. But if you're using a carbon price on a spend-based factor, your only option is to spend less money. And businesses are generally pretty good at, setting that as a goal without your input, right? Everyone's pretty locked in on that one as a metric. So I think a really good, as I said, first off in that procurement space, if you're going to ask the question, weight the outcome. And so that might mean that you have a you have a benchmark, and that benchmark could be a spend-based factor, right? To say, okay, what we want is something ideally coming in less than that, but for that same scope. So it might be scopes 1 and 2 plus the upstream scope 3, for instance, right? So it takes a bit of thinking about that. And then you can go through and take a look at that. Of course, if you have a net zero target and you think you're going to be purchasing offsets to cover scope 3 emissions, then a carbon price might work really well for you, because that is a price that you're going to be incurring sooner or later, depending on when your target is. So you can pop that in there with some real world data and try to understand that exposure some more. But weight the decision, right? Put some, and by which I mean sort of saying, okay, we asked this and that's going to be worth 5% of the threshold, right? And then have a good process, I think, for when you then go back to the supplier and try and refresh that data. There's a lot of platforms out there that will allow you to do that through the tool, which again is very easy for you. But we do want to manage that level of fatigue on the suppliers as well. So that needs to be really as simple and as straightforward as it can possibly be. And then have a think with your procurement people then how else that sits in the context of that engagement and what else you're engaging them around. And or for some suppliers, you might just want to make that contractual. And so that becomes part of the contract review. So where every year, people sit down and say, well, how is this progressing? Yeah, right. They can, we're all coming to the party with like, here's scope 1, 2, and 3. And then you get to, it becomes a really, a regular interval and just a regular part of that discussion in the partnership between the two companies. But I think the core thing is like, know what you want to do with that data and put some weighting on it. Don't expect suppliers to just pony up, this data if it's just going to get plugged into a spreadsheet and then you never really think about it in the context of that relationship.
So what is your recommendations? Look, or top 3 recommendations for companies that are about to face mandatory Scope 3 reporting. So one of them probably is going to be around supplier engagement. But if not, what are the first 3 things those companies should start doing today?
So I think I've said this a few times, but know what you want to achieve, right? So have some really good discussions with your finance folks, your procurement folks, corporate affairs, whoever's involved in this. Are you going to set some targets? Are you just going to try and comply? Are you really wanting your supply base to reduce their emissions? Because that will inform some of the decisions that you are going to make, particularly in the context of sort of category 1 and 2, when we think about Scope 3. I think, on a related note, absolutely circle the wagons. Get all your stakeholders around this topic really early. And that does include your assurers. So have some, really good open conversations about what it is that they are expecting, both in terms of then the disclosure and what it is that they're going to want to understand from you about, again, the assumptions that you've made and the judgments that you've applied and the relevancy tests that you considered in the context of that decision making. And that will be much easier to do if my top 3 tip, you take my advice and write everything down. Just get really good at documenting. There's great AI, on these Zoom calls, get your virtual note taker going on. And I did this more than once, even if I just sat in a room by myself and recorded myself talking, and just said, okay, we decided X, Y, Z, blah, blah, blah. We considered, A, B, C, D.
While it's still fresh in your mind.
Exactly right.
Yeah,
and then you've got some notes that you can just tidy up rather than sort of come back to the blank page a couple of days later.
What was it we discussed again?
Exactly. There's some really simple hacks, but the more you can document, the happier you will be, because of course,
now and in future.
Correct, right? We've all got to come back and do this again. We just as we sort of get to the end and put it down and go like, oh, thank goodness, then you've got a limited amount of time before you're coming back and reassessing all those things and collecting all that data once more.
And talking about your future self, Blaze, what would you do differently now that you've got all this experience? If you were to start from scratch again with your first ASRS report, would there be anything that you'd do differently as opposed to the first time round?
I would really test out some of those relevancy and materiality criteria. And I would, this was a bit of an interesting issue at Iress that arose for us in the context of some of that AASB guidance that came out sort of quite late in our reporting cycle. So we probably couldn't have avoided that. There was not a lot that we could do, but, in an ideal world, I would have thought about that, I guess, perhaps earlier, and might have had something to come up with. I would think, and the other thing I think is actually not necessarily related to Scope 3, but or it kind of is, but in relation to the climate risk and opportunities, is a lot of those folks, there's a lot of folks who come into it and make that determination. And I think what I would do again is sort of keep those folks warmer and more engaged throughout the year, so that you're not just sort of getting to, a workshop that maybe occurs once or twice and then we go back and revisit it. That there's a more consistent way of building that education around, what is scenario analysis, because scenario analysis is really different from ordinary corporate risk management, and that's really important to recognise. But yeah,
and so something that financial practitioners in particular are uncomfortable with, because they're used to historical reporting, not forward-looking statements.
100%, right? And in risk management, you sort of you don't consider divergent futures, right? You think about, well, what's more likely to occur?
Yeah.
Right, and then you sort of do some different assessments. But scenario analysis is exactly the opposite, right? You sort of think about, well, that's occurred, so then what does it look like?
Yeah.
And that is quite a different way of thinking.
Different thinking.
And I would, as I said, if I had my time again, I'd sort of keep some of those folks a bit warmer throughout the year, and engage with them more often. So it was a bit more of a, capability and capacity building cycle.
Amazing. Blaise, you've been absolutely fantastic. I really loved our conversation that spanned the challenges that Iress faced in year one of reporting under S2, the specific deep dive we did on scope 3, looking at relevance, materiality, supplier fatigue, the ecosystem and how everyone has to be engaged, the basis of preparation document, how important it is, and documenting all your assumptions. It has been an amazing journey. I learned so much from you. Thank you so much for sharing all of this information. Now, considering everything that you've said, what's the key message you'd like to leave our listeners with?
Oh, wow. I think it is, I would come back to, maybe something that I had to keep reminding myself of. And this is actually great news. This whole reporting requirement and this reporting cycle, while it is, crazy overwhelming in these first few years, I think for those of us who've, been in the space a little while, we sort of had this moment, right, where all we ever wanted was to sort of be taken as seriously as the financial numbers, and now we are. And so it is, really fantastic. I am quite optimistic about, reporting as a vehicle to drive action, and to move companies forward in the way that they consider some of these issues. So, while we are all very much kind of in the weeds of it, I do remain optimistic, and I encourage everybody to keep thinking that what we're doing is actually laying the groundwork of a really exciting next phase for us.
Oh, I agree. It is an exciting time. Thank you so much for your time, Blaise.
Thank you. Great to be with you again.
That was Blaise Porter from Iress, sharing insights into the company's sustainability journey, their first ASRS report, and the work they've done to understand, disclose, and address Scope 3 emissions. If you'd like to learn more about ASRS reporting or get guidance on tackling Scope 3 emissions in your own organizations, please check out our free course, Navigating the Australian Sustainability Reporting Standards. We'll put a link in the show notes. As always, if you know someone who would find this episode valuable, please share it with them. Let's spread the word on best practices for moving towards net zero emissions. Remember, to reach net zero emissions, aim high, always be curious, and act now. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you in the next episode.